Jim Carrey is one of the funniest people who ever lived, and his face does things that should honestly be impossible for a normal human being. That is exactly what makes his impressions so incredible to watch. He has this rare and almost supernatural ability to completely transform himself into another person just by changing his voice, his face, and the way his body moves. Nobody else in Hollywood has ever been able to do what Jim Carrey does with his face, and that is simply a fact that even his biggest critics would have to agree with. When he slips into a character, it does not look like acting at all. It looks like that person actually walked into the room and took over Jim Carrey's body completely. The whole thing feels like magic every single time you see it happen, whether you are watching it for the first time or the 100th time. One of the most famous and beloved characters Jim Carrey ever created was a guy named Moore. In one memorable and hilarious sketch, Moore calls in from what he describes as divine acreage, and he has a very important report to deliver about the political situation happening down in Canada. He tells everyone listening that things down there are quite a mess and also very confusing at the same time. There is all this big talk about separatism going on, and the whole country, according to Moore, is basically like one giant search commercial. When someone asks him why that is, Moore explains it with complete confidence and total seriousness. The reason, he says, is because Canada has two countries packed into one single place. The way Jim Carrey delivers that punchline with a completely straight face while using that specific voice makes the whole bit land perfectly every single time. In a conversation that took place with the very funny and well-known late-night host Conan O'Brien, Jim Carrey decided to share a story about what it was actually like to have the legendary actor Anthony Hopkins come over to his house for dinner. The whole story is told in that perfectly casual Jim Carrey way where you cannot quite tell where the real story ends and the comedy begins. Jim tells Conan that Anthony Hopkins came over and they sat down together and had a proper dinner, and during that dinner Jim explained to Hopkins that the way he approached his famous character Ace Ventura was that he imagined Ace as a really smart bird. Just a very intelligent bird who happened to also be a pet detective. And when Anthony Hopkins heard that explanation, he looked at Jim and said, very seriously, that he does that too. Hopkins then went on to explain that his iconic and terrifying character Hannibal Lecter was actually a combination of two very specific animals. He was a cross between a crocodile and a spider, specifically a tarantula spider, and what made Hannibal so scary and so effective as a villain was that he had infinite patience and infinite time to just sit completely still and wait for the exact perfect moment to strike. Jim Carrey clearly loved every second of that conversation, and the way he retells it makes the whole audience love it too. Then there is a completely different kind of comedy moment where Jim Carrey riffs on something that a lot of people have wondered about at some point in their lives. He starts talking about what happens when you make a wrong turn while driving and suddenly find yourself in a neighborhood you were not expecting to be in. He calls it the hood and then immediately asks a question that sounds genuinely curious. Why do people call it the hood in the first place? What does that word actually mean when you think about it? His explanation is delivered with total commitment and a completely straight face. According to Jim, the entire city is basically one giant sweatshirt, and the hood is simply the part that you pull up over your head. He presents this theory as if it is the most logical and obvious conclusion anyone could ever reach, and the audience absolutely loses it every time. He then moves into another observation about the very elaborate and complicated way that some people shake hands, all the smacking and slapping and wiggling of fingers that goes into a proper greeting between friends who have not seen each other in a while. He demonstrates the whole thing and points out that by the time the handshake is done, people have basically been smacked and slapped and their hands actually hurt. The physical comedy he brings to even this small moment is what separates him from every other comedian working at the time. Jim Carrey also has this incredible ability to slip into a tour guide character without any warning at all, pointing out famous landmarks to an imaginary group of tourists. On your left, he announces in a very official and professional tour guide voice, is the famous Jeff Goldblum's house. It is delivered so casually and so quickly that it catches you completely off guard every time, which is exactly how the best comedy works. Then in another moment he slips into the voice of someone dealing with a medical condition, talking about being able to afford the miracle drug for restless leg syndrome. These quick little character moments happen so fast and so smoothly that you barely have time to recover from one before the next one hits you. Growing up in Ontario, Canada means that Jim Carrey can slip into the most perfectly stereotypical Canadian voice you have ever heard in your entire life without even trying or thinking about it. It just comes naturally to him because it is where he is from and where he spent the early years of his life. In one of his most beloved Canadian bits, He takes on the voice and personality of someone describing life in Canada as if it were the most extreme and dangerous survival situation imaginable. He talks about boring holes through thick ice just to find food. He describes his good friend Nanak and the two of them working together to build an igloo for protection, not just from the brutal cold but also from polar bears and, perhaps most dangerously of all, flying hockey pucks. The way he describes Canada as a frozen and hostile wasteland where there was much work to be done if they were going to survive the elements is delivered with complete and total seriousness, which makes it 10 times funnier than if he had done it with a wink. Jim Carrey has spoken publicly many times about how much he genuinely admires and respects Clint Eastwood as an actor and as a person. He has said that Eastwood is one of the very few people in all of Hollywood who is truly and completely authentic, meaning the person you see on screen and in public is the actual real person behind closed doors. Jim has praised Eastwood both for his authenticity and for everything he has contributed to the world of movies over his long and remarkable career. So when Jim does his Clint Eastwood impression, there is a layer of real affection underneath the comedy that you can actually feel if you are paying attention. He gets into the famous Dirty Harry character, talking about being careful what you wish for and referencing the .44 Magnum as the most powerful handgun in the world. He does the slow, deliberate speech pattern, the squinting eyes, the quiet intensity that made Clint Eastwood one of the most iconic screen presences in movie history. But then Jim tells the audience what actually happened the very first time he finally got to meet Clint Eastwood in real life. When they finally came face to face, Clint Eastwood simply looked at Jim and told him that he loves the tape of Jim's impression and that he shows it to all of his friends. Coming from someone as cool and as genuine as Clint Eastwood, that is about the highest compliment Jim Carrey could have ever received, and you can tell it genuinely meant something to him. How Jim Carrey's face can magically transform and shapeshift into so many completely different people will forever remain one of the great mysteries of human biology and comedy. Nobody has ever been able to fully explain it or replicate it, and probably nobody ever will. One of the most memorable examples of this incredible ability is his impression of the famous late-night talk show host Jay Leno. Jim completely captures the signature big chin, the loud enthusiastic energy, the way Jay would react with exaggerated shock and disbelief to things his guests said. In the bit, he gets into a whole dramatic moment about what happened to Branford Marsalis and the band, announcing with total authority that the band is banned. He does not care, he insists. He does not need them. As long as he still has his audience, everything is going to be fine. The whole impression is delivered with such commitment and such physical accuracy that if you closed your eyes you would genuinely think you were listening to Jay Leno himself having a complete meltdown on live television. Jim Carrey also does a hilarious bit about his father, and this is one of those moments where you can tell the story comes from a real and personal place even while it is being played completely for laughs. He describes his father as the happiest man on the face of the entire earth, a man who laughs after absolutely everything anyone says to him. But then Jim reveals the key piece of information that explains all of that happiness. His father is deaf in one ear, which means he spends a lot of time dipping his head to one side trying to hear what is being said, and then laughing because he thinks he heard something funny even when he probably did not hear anything at all correctly. Jim demonstrates this with a physical bit of dipping to the side and then laughing, dipping and laughing, over and over, and it gets funnier every single time he repeats it. Then he shares the one time he ever saw his father drop the happiness and become completely serious. That was the day his father tried to teach Jim's sister how to drive a car with a manual transmission, a clutch gearbox, and the frustration and intensity that came out of that experience turned his perpetually happy father into a completely different human being. The bit about letting the clutch out slowly while everything around them is clearly going very wrong is one of those small perfect comedy moments that Jim Carrey does better than almost anyone alive. One of the most important and most underappreciated parts of what makes Jim Carrey so extraordinary as a comedian and as a performer is his physical comedy. Most people think about his voices and his facial expressions first because those are so immediately striking and obvious. But the thing that truly completes his skill set and makes everything work together is his physicality. The man uses his entire body when he performs, and most of the skits and characters he creates require an absolutely absurd amount of flexibility and physical control that you would normally only ever expect to see in professional athletes who have trained their whole lives for it. In one memorable bit about car racing and drafting, he gets completely into the technical mindset of a racing driver explaining strategy, talking about saving energy for the end of the race and making a move at exactly the right moment. The way his whole body gets involved in even this relatively straightforward conversational scene shows you that for Jim Carrey there is no such thing as standing still while he performs. While most of the people Jim Carrey targeted with his impressions in his younger years were Hollywood actors and entertainment figures, as he got older and the world around him changed, his attention shifted increasingly toward politicians and political figures. In one very memorable Halloween-themed bit, he introduces himself with a greeting to America, noting that it is a spooky time of year filled with demons and darkness, and also that it happens to be Halloween. He then points out that for some people it is the only day of the year they will agree to wear a mask, a political joke delivered with perfect comic timing. He talks about Election Day coming right around the corner and how most Americans feel both very excited to vote and also extremely worried about what the outcome is going to be. He gets into poll numbers and the nervous energy that surrounds any major election, delivering all of it with that specific energy that Jim Carrey brings to everything he does, where the comedy and the genuine concern for the world underneath the jokes are both visible at the same time. Jim Carrey also does a brilliantly funny bit about what it would look like if he had chosen a completely different career path and gone into sales instead of comedy and acting. He imagines himself as an insurance salesman, specifically a salesman who sells embarrassment insurance. The concept alone is already funny, but the way Jim plays out the sales pitch, introducing himself with complete professional confidence as someone who can protect you against embarrassment, takes the bit to another level entirely. He brings the same commitment to this small character that he brings to his biggest movie roles, and that total commitment is what makes even a quick 30-second bit feel like a complete and satisfying comedy experience. Then there is his E.T. impression, where he brings the beloved alien character from the famous Steven Spielberg movie to life in a completely unexpected way, having E.T. introduce himself as Frank and announce that he would like to sing a song that came out in 1979 and was a very big hit for him. The absurdity of E.T. having a 1979 hit song is so perfectly random and so specifically weird that it lands immediately with anyone watching it. A couple of decades ago, you could not even watch a television commercial without running the risk that Jim Carrey was going to make fun of it in some incredibly specific and accurate way. One of his most memorable commercial parodies is his take on a casino advertisement, presented in the style of a pitchman named Telly Sales from the 90s. He gets into the breathless, enthusiastic energy of those old casino commercials, talking about the Players Club and getting up to 110% off on shows and rooms and meals, offering VIP treatment to everyone watching. He demands a suite with a hot-shaped bag, whatever that means, and the whole thing escalates into wonderful chaos as he tries to get a bellboy named Tony to fit him in, celebrates winning at bingo, and ends up in the front row demanding to know what everyone wants from him. The physical energy he brings to this parody of an already very energetic style of commercial makes the whole thing feel like it might genuinely fall apart at any moment, which is exactly the right feeling for that kind of comedy. Jim Carrey then transitions into a completely different kind of character, someone who has come aboard a vessel to warn the crew about their enslavement. He delivers this with all the serious dramatic intensity of a science fiction hero making a critical announcement, insisting that what he is saying is not poppycock and that these people are not as free as they think they are. He demands to be connected to Starfleet Command, and the whole bit plays out like a scene from a very serious space drama that has been invaded by Jim Carrey's particular brand of beautiful chaos. There is also a quick and very funny bit about a man who used to be powerful, a former English teacher whose legacy has apparently been reduced to doing cartoon voiceovers. Someone recites the old grammar rule about the letter I coming before E except after C, and then wonders out loud what doing cartoon voiceovers would actually be like. Jim immediately launches into the most perfect Tweety Bird impression you have ever heard in your life, doing the famous line about thinking he saw a putty tat with complete accuracy and total commitment, and the audience absolutely loves every second of it. Jim Carrey also manages to work the name Roberto Benigni into one of his iconic speeches, referencing the famous Italian actor and filmmaker in a bit about voting and elections. He talks about how he genuinely thought that voting for himself was going to make the difference and change everything, but then sighs and admits that you really do have to get out there and actually talk to people if you want to make a real impact. And then he delivers the punchline that he has been beaten by Roberto Benigni, who has jumped into his ocean, which is one of those perfectly specific and wonderfully weird Jim Carrey images that makes absolutely no logical sense and is completely hilarious for exactly that reason. Clint Eastwood clearly wins the overall impression count in terms of how many times he shows up throughout Jim Carrey's body of work. In another Eastwood moment, Jim gets Clint to reach out for help, asking Jay for assistance because he is going into an impressionist bit and needs someone to throw some water on him quick to snap him out of it. The whole meta-quality of a Jim Carrey impression of Clint Eastwood asking for help because he is going into an impression is the kind of layered comedy that only Jim Carrey could pull off without losing the audience. One of the most surprising and genuinely shocking impressions Jim Carrey has ever done is his take on the beloved children's television host Mr. Rogers. The bit starts out completely innocently, with someone running into Mr. Rogers and expressing genuine and heartfelt admiration for everything he contributed to the lives of children growing up. The person tells Mr. Rogers how much they loved watching him and how much he shaped them as a person, and Mr. Rogers responds warmly, saying he is glad to hear that seeing young girls grow into women like the person standing before him gives him such a warm feeling in his heart. And then, without any warning at all, the impression takes a sharp and completely unexpected left turn into territory that is absolutely not appropriate for children, which is of course the entire point of the joke. The contrast between the wholesome Mr. Rogers setup and where Jim Carrey takes it is so sudden and so perfectly timed that the audience completely loses it. He ends the bit with Mr. Rogers telling the person to go ahead and tell anyone they want about what just happened, because nobody is ever going to believe them. He is Mr. Rogers, after all.